I was standing at a podium in front of 150 investors when my brother mouthed, "You are dead." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that has weight to it, pressing down on my shoulders while the sweat started to itch under my starch-stiffened collar. I stood there for a second too long, my hand still gripping the sides of the podium so hard, my knuckles were turning the color of the white linen tablecloths. I had managed to pull it back from the brink, maybe, but the look in Brandon's eyes wasn't one of relief. It was the look of a man who had just watched his life flash before his eyes and was now calculating the most efficient way to dispose of the body responsible for it. The lead investor from Apex Capital, a guy named Marcus, who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of granite and dressed in a $5,000 suit, finally broke the quiet. He didn't clap, he just leaned back, tapped his fountain pen against his chin, and looked at Brandon. "Hardest working man in the city," Marcus repeated, his voice low and gravelly. That's a bold claim for a guy who apparently cried to an audiobook on the way to a consulate. A few people chuckled, but it was that nervous, high-stakes laughter that makes you want to bolt for the nearest exit. I felt the heat rising in my neck. I tried to think of a follow-up, something to smooth it over, but my brain was a total vacuum. I just nodded dumbly, stepped away from the mic, and navigated the maze of tables back to our booth. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. When I sat down, the air at our table was freezing. Sarah, the lead dev who had just given that flawless presentation, wouldn't even look at me. She was staring at her iPad, her jaw set so tight I thought her teeth might crack. Brandon didn't move. He didn't look at me either. He just sat there with his hands folded on the table, staring straight ahead at the podium where the next speaker was being introduced. "Brandon, man, I started, leaning in close so the neighboring tables couldn't hear. "Don't," he whispered. His voice was flat. No anger, which was actually way worse. "Just don't say another word until we are out of this building." The rest of the dinner was a blur of expensive steak I couldn't chew, and wine that tasted like battery acid. Every time I looked around, I caught someone pointing or whispering. I was the brother, the liability, the guy who mentioned the Wendy's spatula incident in front of the people holding the checkbooks. When the gala finally wound down around 11 p.m., the networking started. This was the part Brandon had been prepping for months. The mingle. I stood in the corner by a decorative fern, trying to look invisible, watching him work the room. He was good. He was smiling, shaking hands, pitching the technical specs of the AI platform like the earlier disaster hadn't happened. But I noticed Marcus from Apex was hovering near the bar, watching Brandon with a look that wasn't exactly convinced. Around midnight, we finally hit the valet stand. The cool Seattle air hit my face, and for a second, I thought I was in the clear. Then the valet brought around Brandon's beat-up Tesla, the one thing he hadn't sold to fund the startup, and we got in. He didn't start the car. He just sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, staring through the windshield at the Fairmont's neon sign. "The painted gravel?" Brandon said. It was barely a whisper. "I was trying to be relatable," I said, my voice cracking. "You know, the started from the bottom thing. People love a garage story. I was 12, Leo. I was 12 years old, and you told a room full of institutional investors that I have a history of fraudulent business practices. Nobody took that seriously. It was a joke about kids. Marcus took it seriously," Brandon snapped, finally turning to look at me. His face was pale under the streetlights. He pulled me aside during the dessert course. He didn't ask about the latency of the neural net. He didn't ask about our projected Q3 growth. He asked if I still had issues with honesty and professional stability. Those were his exact words. I felt a pit form in my stomach. "I fixed it at the end, though. I told them you're a workhorse. You told them I'm a desperate workhorse who doesn't know when to quit. You made me sound like a liability who happens to be a grind." He finally hit the power button, and the car whirred to life. "I have a follow-up meeting with Apex at 8 a.m. tomorrow. They were supposed to sign the term sheet tonight. They didn't." He drove me back to my apartment in total silence. Not even the radio. Just the sound of the tires on the wet pavement. When he pulled up to the curb, he didn't even unlock the doors at first. "I need you to stay away from the office for a while," he said. "What?" "Brandon, I'm your head of PR. Well, unofficial PR. Exactly. Unofficial. And after tonight, non-existent. I can't have you near the investors, Leo. I love you, but you're a wrecking ball." I got out of the car, and he sped off before I even closed the door properly. I walked up to my place, tossed the rented tux on the floor, and sat on the edge of my bed. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mike. "How'd the speech go? You kill it?" I didn't reply. I just stared at the wall until the sun started to come up. At 9:15 a.m. the next morning, my phone rang. It was Brandon. I answered on the first ring, expecting an apology, or maybe the news that they got the funding anyway. "Leo," he said. He sounded tired, like he hadn't slept a minute. "Yeah? Did the meeting happen? Is Marcus cool?" "The meeting happened, but Marcus isn't the problem anymore. He brought a guest, someone who saw the live stream last night." "Who? Do you remember Mr. Henderson from the middle school incident?" I felt the blood drain from my face. Henderson was the principal who had handled the moon rock thing. He was also, as it turned out, a silent partner in one of the smaller VC firms that Apex partnered with for due diligence. "He remembered the gravel," Brandon said, his voice trembling, "and he told Marcus that the reason I was suspended wasn't just the rocks. He told him about the inventory logs I faked for the school store. Things I didn't even remember doing, Leo. Things that were buried 20 years ago. But that's ancient history," I said, standing up and pacing my small kitchen. "That's literally childhood stuff, not when you're asking for $3 million to manage sensitive data. Trust is the only currency we have right now, and you opened a door I had spent a decade closing. Marcus wants a full forensic audit of our current books before they move forward. Not just a standard check, a full deep dive audit. We don't have time for that, Leo. Our runway ends in 3 weeks." I sat back down. The weight of it hit me all at once. My winging it hadn't just embarrassed him. It had triggered a chain reaction that was digging up ghosts he'd worked his entire adult life to outrun. "What can I do?" I asked. "Nothing," Brandon said. "You've done enough. Just stay by your phone. I might need you to talk to the auditors to verify some of the early personal loans I took from the family, since you were the one who signed as a witness. And for the love of God, don't wing that conversation." He hung up. I looked at my kitchen table, at the stack of mail I hadn't opened, and the half-empty pizza box from 2 nights ago. I realized then that my life of just getting by on charm and luck had finally collided with someone else's reality, and the damage was still spreading. 2 hours later, there was a knock at my door. I figured it was the delivery I'd ordered, but when I opened it, it wasn't a guy with a bag of food. It was Sarah, the lead dev. She looked like she'd been crying. "He's resigning," she said, not even saying hello. Who? Brandon. Why? The board, she said, pushing past me into the apartment. The minority shareholders saw the stream. They saw the unfiltered look into his character you provided. They're using the audit as leverage. They told him if he doesn't step down as CEO, they'll leak the history of fraud to the tech blogs. They want to install their own guy to save the investment. I felt like I was watching a building collapse in slow motion. He can't resign. It's his company. He built the tech in my garage. It doesn't matter who built it anymore, Sarah said, turning to face me, her eyes sharp and angry. It matters who owns the reputation. And right now, thanks to your little comedy routine, his reputation is a joke. He's in his office right now packing a box, Leo. He's losing everything because you couldn't be bothered to write a script. I looked at the $400 tuxedo bag hanging on my closet door. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I had wanted to make him look human, to give him a personable edge in a room full of robots, and instead, I'd handed his enemies the exact weapon they needed to kill his career. I have to go talk to him, I said, grabbing my keys. Don't, Sarah said, her hand on the doorframe. He doesn't want to see you. And honestly, neither do I. We worked 18-hour days for 2 years for this. You just had to talk for 10 minutes. She left, slamming the door behind her. I stood in the middle of my living room, the silence returning, but this time it was louder. My phone buzzed again. A notification from LinkedIn. Congratulations to Brandon on his new role. The system was already updating. The world was moving on, and my brother was being erased from his own dream because of a joke about a Wendy's spatula. I headed for the door anyway. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a script, and for the first time in my life, that terrified me. I took the stairs down, 2 at a time. The Seattle drizzle had turned into a steady, freezing rain, the kind that soaks right through your jacket before you even make it to your car. I drove my 10-year-old Civic across the Fremont Bridge, the wipers squeaking against the glass, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my forearms ached. Brandon's office wasn't in some sleek downtown high-rise. It was on the second floor of a converted warehouse in Ballard, sandwiched between a craft brewery and a place that repaired industrial espresso machines. The air over there always smelled like stale hops and burnt rubber. It was a scrappy place for a scrappy company, the kind of place where people slept under their desks on beanbag chairs and lived on energy drinks. I parked in the loading zone. I didn't care if I got a ticket. I buzzed myself in using the backdoor code Brandon had given me months ago, 0411, our mom's birthday. The heavy metal door clicked open, and I walked up the concrete stairwell, my wet sneakers squeaking on the steps. The office was basically one giant room with exposed brick, a dozen standing desks, and a glass-enclosed conference room in the back they called the fishbowl. Usually, this place sounded like a frantic LAN party, keyboards clacking, people shouting over each other, the espresso machine screaming. Today, it was like a morgue. There were only 4 people out on the main floor. They were all staring at their monitors in dead silence. Nobody looked up when I walked in. Sarah wasn't there. I looked toward the fishbowl. Brandon was inside. He wasn't packing a box like Sarah had said. He was sitting at the cheap IKEA conference table, flanked by 2 people I didn't recognize. One was a guy in a tailored charcoal suit who looked like he belonged back at the Fairmont, looking thoroughly bored. The other was an older woman with a severe bob haircut, typing aggressively on a sleek silver laptop. Brandon looked up and saw me standing on the main floor. He didn't glare. He didn't wave me off. He just closed his eyes and let his head drop slightly, like he was physically in pain. The guy in the charcoal suit followed Brandon's gaze, turned around in his chair, and looked right at me. He whispered something to the woman, then stood up, adjusted his tie, and opened the glass door. "Can we help you?" he asked. His voice was polite, but the kind of polite that costs $500 an hour. "I'm Leo," I said, walking toward the room. "Brandon's brother." "Ah," the suit said. He gave me a thin, utterly humorless smile. "The keynote speaker. Perfect timing, actually. Come on in." I walked into the conference room. It smelled like dry erase markers and anxious sweat. Brandon was staring at a thick stack of paper in front of him. There was a yellow sticky note on the top page, pointing to a signature line. "Leo, get out of here," Brandon said. His voice was hollow. It didn't even sound like him. "No, I think your brother should stay," the suit said, closing the glass door behind me. "I'm David Vance. I represent the minority shareholder block, and this is Miss Gable, our outside counsel." I stood at the edge of the table. "Look, whatever this is, it's my fault. The stuff I said last night, it was a joke. A stupid, terrible joke. Brandon is the cleanest guy I know. You can't force him out over a middle school prank and a bad speech." "Sit down, Leo," Brandon muttered, rubbing his temples. "No, I'm not going to sit down. You guys are using a technicality to steal his company." David Vance chuckled. It wasn't a nice sound. "We aren't stealing anything, Leo. We are exercising our fiduciary duty to protect our investment from a liability. And frankly, the joke last night just prompted us to look under the hood a little earlier than we planned. Miss Gable, if you would." The woman stopped typing and turned her laptop around to face me. On the screen was a scanned copy of a document. It looked like a standard promissory note. "In 2022, Miss Gable said, her voice crisp and robotic, Brandon secured a $75,000 friends and family loan to cover the initial server costs. You acted as the guarantor and witness for that loan, correct?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, so what? We paid that back." "Well, he paid it back." "He did," Miss Gable agreed. "But during our preliminary audit this morning, we found a discrepancy. The loan was recorded as coming from a corporate entity, Leo Vance LLC. However, public state records indicate that your LLC was dissolved for failure to file annual reports 3 months prior to the date on this document." My stomach hit the floor. I forgot to file the renewal paperwork for the LLC that year," I said, my voice suddenly barely above a whisper. "I just did it under my own name. It's the same money. It was just my savings." "It is decidedly not the same thing," David said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "Mixing personal and dissolved corporate funds to capitalize a tech startup isn't just sloppy, Leo. It breaches the representations and warranties Brandon signed in our initial term sheet regarding the clean origin of all early-stage capital. It's a material breach of contract." I looked at Brandon. He was staring out the glass wall at the empty desks, his jaw clenched tight. "I didn't know," Brandon said quietly to the window. "I trusted you to handle the filing. You told me it was done. I meant to." I pleaded, stepping closer to him. "I swear I meant to. I got busy, and then I forgot, and then I figured it didn't matter, because the check cleared anyway." "It matters," David said. He tapped the stack of papers in front of Brandon. "Because it means the foundational intellectual property assignment of this company is tied agreed to a fraudulent financial transaction, which gives the board the legal right to void Brandon's equity vest and terminate him for cause. I felt all the air leave the room. They weren't just firing him, they were taking his shares. They were taking everything he had built for 2 years. You can't do that, I said, my voice shaking now. It was a clerical error. My error. Punish me. I'll sign whatever you want. You don't own anything here for us to punish, David replied flatly. Brandon does. Or rather, he did. He turned back to Brandon. The severance agreement is more than fair under the circumstances. 6 months salary, and we won't pursue litigation over the LLC fraud. We will frame it internally as a mutual parting of ways. But you need to sign it now, Brandon. If we walk out of this room without a signature, the offer is pulled, we go to court, and we make sure every VC in Silicon Valley knows exactly why your funding fell through. Brandon reached out and picked up the pen. It was a cheap blue plastic pen. It felt completely wrong for a moment like this. He looked at the tip of it for a long time. Brandon, don't, I begged. Let me call a lawyer. We can fight this. It's a mistake. Go home, Leo, he said. He didn't look up. Please, just wait. Just give me a day to fix it. You fix things? Brandon finally looked at me, and the absolute exhaustion in his eyes made me take a physical step back. Since when do you fix things? You break things, Leo. You wing it, you laugh it off, and you leave the mess for someone else to clean up. I'm cleaning up your mess right now. This is me cleaning it up. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. Miss Gable immediately pulled the stack of papers toward her, checked the signature, and slipped it into her leather briefcase. David stood up and buttoned his jacket. We'll need your building keys and your company laptop before you leave the premises today, David said. Security will deactivate your badge at 5 p.m. I suggest you don't speak to the remaining staff on your way out. They walked out of the conference room, leaving the door open behind them. Brandon didn't move for a long time. He just stared at the empty space on the table where the contract had been. Then, very slowly, he stood up and walked over to his desk in the corner of the fishbowl. He pulled a cardboard box from under his desk and started throwing things into it. A framed photo of our parents, a coffee mug I bought him for his 30th birthday that said, Times World's Okayest Boss, a stack of notebooks. I walked over and reached for a stack of technical manuals to help him pack. He slapped my hand away. It wasn't a violent hit, but it was sharp and fast, like I had burned him. Don't touch my stuff, he said. Brandon, I am so sorry. I'll pay you back. I'll figure out the severance. I'll take out a loan. He let out a dry, broken laugh that scraped against the walls of the small room. With what credit, Leo? You work 30 hours a week at a sporting goods store. You owe me $3 grand for your car repairs. Do you have any idea what's actually happening right now? You got 6 months severance, I said, trying to find some kind of silver lining. That's a cushion. You can start something new. You're brilliant. You can code another. I maxed out my personal credit cards last month to make payroll, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the people outside the glass couldn't hear. $80,000, Leo. I floated the company 80 grand because the seed money was supposed to hit tomorrow. The Series A was going to reimburse me. I signed a personal guarantee. I froze. What? I am personally on the hook for $80,000 of unsecured debt, he said, zipping his laptop bag with a violent jerk. And I don't have a job to pay it back. The severance will cover my rent for a few months maybe. Then I'm done. I have to sell the car. I have to break my lease. He picked up the cardboard box. It looked incredibly heavy. Get out of my way, he said. I stepped aside. He walked out of the fishbowl and onto the main floor. The 4 employees sitting at their desks finally looked up. Nobody said a word. They just watched him carry his box toward the exit. It was a walk of shame, quiet and brutal. I followed him down the concrete stairs and out into the rain. He popped the trunk of his Tesla and dropped the box inside. The rain was coming down harder now, matting his hair to his forehead. I'm going to fix this, I said to his back. I didn't know how, but I couldn't just let it end like this in a wet parking lot. Brandon slammed the trunk shut and turned to face me. The rain was washing down his face. You want to fix it? He asked. Really? Yes. Tell me what to do. Stay away from me, he said. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't show up at my apartment. For the first time in your life, do exactly what you are told. He got into the car, locked the doors, and drove away. I stood in the loading zone, the rain soaking through my jacket, watching his taillights disappear around the corner of the brewery. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was wet, making it hard to read, but I could see the caller ID. It was our dad. He never called me during the workday. He was a retired contractor who treated 9 to 5 hours like religious law. If he was calling me at 11:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, he already knew something was wrong. I let it ring. I stood there in the rain and just let it vibrate in my hand until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started ringing again. I wiped the screen on my wet shirt and swiped to answer. Hey, Dad, I said. Leo, his voice barked through the speaker, tight and stressed. Where's your brother? His phone is going straight to voicemail. He's in transit right now. I lied. The first instinct, always winging it, always covering up. What's up? I just got a call from the bank, Dad said, his voice dropping an octave. The home equity line I took out for him last year, the one he's been making the interest payments on, they just flagged a missed payment. Brandon never misses a payment. What the hell happened at that dinner last night? I squeezed the phone so hard the edges dug into my palm. A missed payment? Dad, it's just a clerical thing. The banks are switching servers or something. Brandon told me about it this morning. I hated myself the second the words left my mouth. Another lie. Winging it. Just kicking the can down the road until it inevitably blew up in someone else's face. Dad let out a heavy breath that rattled the speaker. Leo, don't play me. I called his bank. They didn't say anything about servers. They said the account had insufficient funds to process the automatic draw. Insufficient funds. Brandon is supposed to be sitting on $3 million of investor money today. How does his personal account bounce a $900 interest payment? The seed money, I stammered, the rain dripping off my nose and onto the screen. It got delayed. Just a little snag with the paperwork. You know how these venture capital guys are? They have to dot every I and cross every T. Delayed until when? A few days, maybe a week. 2. Leo. My dad's voice went dead flat. That home equity line is for $150,000. We put the house up so your brother could build this thing. He looked your mother in the eye and promised her the house was safe because the Series A funding was a lock. If he defaults on this, the bank doesn't take his startup. They take our house. My knees actually buckled a little. I had to lean against a wet brick wall to stay upright. $150,000 plus the $80,000 Brandon just told me about. My brother, the guy who used to map out his Halloween candy consumption on a spreadsheet, was $250,000 in the hole, and I had just handed his company company over to the wolves. Dad, I have to go, I said, my voice cracking. I'm going to find him. I'll make sure the payment gets made today, even if I have to front it myself. With what? Dad asked, but I had already hung up. I stood there in the alley for a long time, letting the rain soak completely through my clothes. The cold wasn't bothering me anymore. All I could feel was a hot, suffocating panic rising in my chest. I got back into my Civic. The interior smelled like wet dog and old fast food. I turned the heater on blast, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app. Available balance, $412.18. That wouldn't even cover half of the interest payment on Dad's loan, let alone touch Brandon's 80 grand, let alone buy back a tech company. I dropped the phone on the passenger seat and just stared at the steering wheel. For the first time in my 26 years on Earth, there was no joke to make. There was no charm offensive that could fix this. I couldn't smile my way out of a breached contract and $250,000 in debt. I put the car in drive and headed toward downtown Seattle. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew who had the power to undo it. Apex Capital was located in one of those terrifyingly sleek glass towers on 4th Avenue, the kind of building where the lobby echoes no matter how softly you walk, and the security guards look like ex-military contractors in tailored suits. I walked in, dripping wet, wearing jeans and a damp windbreaker. I must have looked like a stray dog wandering into a Michelin star restaurant. I went straight to the front desk. The receptionist was a woman in her 20s with perfect posture and an expression that said she was already tired of me. I need to see Marcus, I said. Or David Vance. She didn't even blink. Do you have an appointment, sir? No, but I'm Brandon's brother, the guy from the dinner last night. They know exactly who I am. Tell them Leo is here. She typed something on her keyboard, her eyes never leaving her monitor. Mr. Vance and Mr. Sterling are currently in meetings and are not available to walk-ins. I can leave a message for their assistance. It's an emergency, I said, leaning over the marble counter. They just forced my brother out of his company over a paperwork error that I made. They're stealing his life's work. I just need 5 minutes to explain. Sir, she said, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree, I am going to ask you to step back from the desk. If you'd like to leave a message, I will pass it along. I looked over my shoulder. One of the security guards was already walking our way, his eyes locked on me. He wasn't hurrying, but he wasn't strolling either. Okay, I said, backing up, holding my hands up a little. Okay, no problem. I'll wait. I walked over to a row of uncomfortable-looking leather chairs near the elevators and sat down. The guard stopped, watched me for a moment, and then went back to his post by the turnstiles. I sat there for 2 hours. My clothes slowly dried in the aggressive air conditioning, leaving me shivering. Around 2:15 p.m., the elevator chimed, and David Vance walked out. He was holding a sleek leather portfolio, talking animatedly to another guy in a suit. I stood up immediately and intercepted them before they hit the revolving doors. David, I said, stepping right into his path. He stopped, blinking in surprise, then let out a heavy sigh. He turned to the guy he was with. Give me a minute, John. I'll meet you at the car. The other guy nodded and walked out. David turned to me, his polite $500 an hour smile firmly in place. Leo, he said, are you stalking my lobby now? Because building security is quite strict about loitering. I need you to tear up that severance agreement, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. The LLC thing was my fault. I'll go on the record. I'll sign an affidavit. I'll talk to the SEC or whoever regulates this stuff. I committed the fraud, not Brandon. You can't punish him for my mistake. David looked at me for a long moment, the fake smile slowly fading. He checked his watch, then looked around the lobby to make sure no one was close enough to hear us. Leo, you're operating under the assumption that this is about the LLC, he said, his voice dropping to a conversational murmur. Or that it's about your disastrous stand-up routine last night. It isn't. I frowned. What are you talking about? You literally brought a lawyer to the office to terminate him over the LLC. That was the mechanism, David corrected smoothly. Not the reason. The reason is that Brandon is a phenomenal coder, but he is a terrible CEO. He refuses to pivot. He is obsessed with data privacy and encryption standards that are strangling the platform's ability to scale. We've been trying to get him to monetize the user data for 6 months, and he flat out refused. He called it unethical. David rolled his eyes slightly. He's a purist. Purists don't make 300% returns. I just stared at him. You wanted him out anyway. We needed a scalable leader. We had a CEO replacement lined up 3 weeks ago, David said, adjusting his cuffs. But Brandon's equity was ironclad. We couldn't just vote him out without triggering a massive buyout clause that would have drained our own capital. We needed cause. He stepped a little closer, the smell of expensive cologne hitting me. Then you stood up at that dinner, David said softly, and you told a room full of our limited partners that your brother is historically untrustworthy and emotionally unstable. You spooked Marcus. You handed us a narrative, and when we dug into the paperwork to see if there was anything to back up that narrative, we found your little LLC discrepancy. It was a gift, Leo. You handed us the keys to the company on a silver platter. That's illegal, I said, my voice thick with a mix of rage and absolute terror. That's extortion. It's business, David countered smoothly. Brandon signed the termination agreement. It's done. He accepted the buyout. If you go to the authorities and try to claim fraud on your own LLC, you won't save his company. You'll just go to federal prison for wire fraud, and Brandon will still be out of a job, only now he'll have a brother in jail. He patted my shoulder too light, patronizing taps that made my skin crawl. Go home, Leo. Learn to balance a checkbook. Leave the corporate restructuring to the adults. He walked past me, pushed through the revolving doors, and disappeared into the Seattle foot traffic. I stood in the lobby, the cold marble floor suddenly feeling like a trapdoor that had just opened under my feet. It wasn't an accident. I hadn't just stumbled into a mistake. I had been the exact idiot they needed to execute a corporate coup. I pulled my phone out again. I had to tell Brandon. I had to tell him that they had been planning this for weeks, that it wasn't entirely because of my speech. Maybe that would make it better. Maybe that would take some of the heat off me. I dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail again. I texted him. I just talked to David Vance. You need to call me right now. It's a setup. I waited. Nothing. I walked out of the building and back to my car. I drove to Brandon's apartment in Capitol Hill. It was a small, overpriced one-bedroom on the 4th floor of a newer building. I buzzed his apartment from the lobby. No answer. I waited for someone to walk out and caught the door before it locked, slipping inside. I rode the elevator up and knocked on his door. Brandon, I called out, knocking harder. Open up, man. I know you're in there. Nothing. I pressed my ear against the wood. I couldn't hear any movement. No TV, no music, but I noticed something on the floor right in front of the door. A small white envelope slipped halfway under the crack. I crouched down and pulled it out. It was unsealed. I opened the flap and slid out a heavy piece of cardstock. It was a notice from the property management company, a 3-day notice to pay or vacate. He was 2 months behind on rent. I stared at the paper, the reality of my brother's secret financial ruin crashing over me again. He had dumped everything, literally every cent he had or could borrow, into that company to keep it afloat while they waited for the Apex money, and I had just helped Apex steal it for free. The door to the apartment across the hall clicked open, and an older woman in a thick cardigan peered out at me. "He's not there," she said, eyeing me suspiciously. "Do you know where he went?" I asked, standing up quickly. "No idea. He came back about an hour ago carrying a cardboard box, looking like a drowned rat. Stayed for maybe 10 minutes. Then he left with a duffel bag." "A duffel bag? That's what I said," she muttered, pulling her door shut. I ran my hands through my hair, panic rising fast now. Brandon wasn't a runaway kind of guy. He was a stay and organize the disaster into color-coded folders kind of guy. If he was packing a bag, he was breaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I yanked it out, praying it was him. It was a text from an unknown number. "If you want to know how bad this really is, meet me at the Alibi Room in Pike Place in 20 minutes. Come alone." I stared at the screen. The Alibi Room. It was a dark, subterranean bar hidden in the alleyway near the gum wall. I didn't know the number, but I recognized the aggressive, clipped tone of the text. It was Sarah. I didn't text back. I just turned around, shoved my phone into my wet pocket, and ran back to my car. Traffic on I-5 was a nightmare, a crawling line of red taillights blurring in the rain. It took me 40 minutes to get to Pike Place Market. I parked in a loading zone next to a seafood stall that was shutting down for the day, ignored the angry shout from a guy in rubber boots, and jogged down the cobblestone alley toward the gum wall. The Alibi Room is underground, tucked beneath the market, smelling like brick dust and old beer. My eyes had to adjust to the dark after the gray glare of the street. It was practically empty, just a couple of tourists in the corner and a bartender wiping glasses. Sarah was sitting in a booth in the very back. She had a half-empty pint of IPA in front of her and her laptop open. She didn't look up when I slid into the booth across from her. "I thought you said you didn't want to see me again," I said, catching my breath. "I don't," Sarah said, her eyes still glued to the screen. "But I hate David Vance more than I hate you, which is saying a lot right now." "Vance set him up," I said, leaning forward. "He told me. They had a new CEO ready to go. They just used my speech and the LLC thing to trigger the termination clause." "I know," Sarah said, finally looking at me. She looked completely drained. The bags under her eyes were dark purple. "The new CEO walked in 20 minutes after you left, a guy named Sterling. He immediately called an all-hands meeting, told us Brandon had stepped down due to personal health reasons, and asked me to hand over the master admin credentials." My stomach tightened. "Did you?" "I'm legally obligated to," she said. She took a sip of her beer. "But here's the thing about guys like Vance and Sterling. They think software is just a button you press. They think because they bought the building and the brand, they bought the machine. They didn't even check the server logs before they fired him." "What do you mean?" Sarah turned her laptop around. It was a dense wall of code and system architecture diagrams that I couldn't even begin to read. "The platform Apex thinks they just bought is a shell," Sarah said quietly. "The user interface, the front-end API, the marketing site, it's all sitting on AWS servers. But the actual brain, the trained neural net weights, the core proprietary algorithm?" She tapped the screen with her index finger. "Brandon didn't trust the cloud with the core model. He kept it locally hosted, air-gapped, on physical servers." I stared at her, the memory hitting me like a physical blow. "The week before the banquet. The servers we hauled across town, from the Ballard office to his storage unit." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Brandon told Vance he was moving them for off-site backup compliance. Vance didn't care. He doesn't know the difference between a backup and the primary engine, so Apex doesn't have the AI. Apex has a very expensive, very hollow piece of software that cannot process a single piece of data," Sarah said. "Sterling just figured it out about an hour ago. The Ballard office is in full meltdown. They're threatening to call the police and report Brandon for grand larceny and theft of company property." "But they can't do that," I said, panic flaring again. "If he stole it, he goes to jail." "Leo, listen to me," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. "Who bought those physical servers? I looked at the original hardware manifests this afternoon. Brandon didn't buy them with the seed money. He bought them a year ago, with a $75,000 cash injection." My mouth went dry. "The friends and family loan, the money from my LLC." "Right," Sarah said, leaning in. "The dissolved LLC. The exact same financial transaction that David Vance just explicitly voided in a legally binding termination agreement. Do you understand what that means?" Vance went on the record, in writing, stating that those funds were fraudulently mixed and legally distinct from the company's capitalization. By voiding that contract to steal Brandon's shares, Vance legally separated those physical servers from Apex's assets. I felt the blood rushing in my ears. "They aren't company property." "No," Sarah said, a hard, cold smile forming on her face. "They belong to the entity that funded them. They belong to you, Leo. And so does the only existing copy of the trained AI model. But Brandon doesn't know that. He thinks he lost everything." "Where is he?" "The duffel bag," I muttered, piecing it together. "He was 2 months behind on rent. He had a bag. He wasn't running away. He was retreating to the only place he had left. He went home, to my dad's house." I didn't even say goodbye to Sarah. I ran out of the bar, practically sprinting up the wet cobblestones to my car. The drive to our parents' house in Bellevue took another hour in the traffic. I pulled into the driveway. Dad's truck was gone. Mom was probably still at work, but the garage door was open about 2 feet at the bottom, just enough to let the exhaust vent out. I ducked under the heavy wooden door and stood up inside the dim, oil-stained garage. Brandon was sitting on a plastic cooler. He was staring straight ahead at a massive, humming stack of black metal server racks, the ones we had moved. He had a heavy steel claw hammer resting across his knees. He looked up at me when I walked in, his eyes red and dead hollow. "I told you to stay away from me," he said. His voice was completely flat. "Put the hammer down, Brandon. I have to destroy them," he said, gripping the handle. "If I smash the drives, it's over. Apex can sue me, but they can't have the model. I'll declare bankruptcy. I'll spend the next 10 years paying Dad back for the house. It's the only way to kill it." "You don't have to kill it," I said, walking slowly toward him. "Sarah told me everything. I know about the local hosting." "Then you know they're going to send the cops here," he said. "Vance probably already filed the report." "Let them," I said. I stood right in front of him. "Those servers don't belong to Apex. They belong to me." me. He blinked, confusion breaking through the exhaustion. What? I explained it to him. I laid out every word Sarah had said. The voided contract, the LLC discrepancy, the legal reality that David Vance, in his arrogance, had used a technicality that accidentally severed the company's ownership of its own brain. Brandon sat there in silence for a long time. He looked at the servers, then looked at his hands, then looked at me. The gears in his head, the ones that had been frozen by panic and betrayal, slowly started turning again. He voided the initial cap table, Brandon whispered. He explicitly stated the funds were invalid for equity assignment, which means my invalid funds bought the hardware, I said. I own the servers. You own the code in your head. Apex owns a really nice logo. Brandon dropped the hammer. It hit the concrete floor with a loud, ringing clang. He put his hands over his face and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Get your laptop, I said. 10 minutes later, we were sitting at our parents' kitchen table. Brandon had his laptop open, drafting an email. I was pacing the linoleum floor. They need this model online by the end of the month, or they lose their Series A partners, Brandon said, his fingers flying across the keys. The life was back in his eyes. Sterling doesn't know how to rebuild the architecture. It would take them a year to retrain the neural net from scratch. So we sell it to them, I said. Not the company. We just sell them the hardware and a non-exclusive license to the IP. Brandon stopped typing and looked at me. How much? Enough to clear your 80 grand. Enough to pay off Dad's home equity line in full right now. I took a deep breath. And enough for you to start over without them. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number David Vance had called me from earlier. I put it on speaker and set it on the kitchen table. It rang twice. Leo, Vance's voice came through, sounding tight and clipped. If this is another plea for your brother, you are wasting my time. In fact, I'm currently drafting a police report for stolen property. Don't bother, I said. I pulled a piece of lined notebook paper out of my pocket. While Brandon was getting his laptop, I had sat in the garage and actually written down exactly what I needed to say. Bullet points, facts, no jokes, no winging it. I just reviewed the termination agreement you forced Brandon to sign. I read from the paper, specifically Section 4, where you legally separated the $75,000 LLC loan from the company assets, which means the 6 local servers purchased with those funds, the ones holding the proprietary neural net, are my personal property. Silence on the other end of the line. I am currently in possession of those servers, I continued, reading my own handwriting carefully. I'm willing to sell them to Apex Capital, along with a perpetual, non-exclusive license to the codebase. The price is $2 million, wired by 5 p.m. today. You are out of your mind, Vance hissed. That is extortion. We will sue you into the ground. You can try, I said smoothly. But litigation takes 2 years. Your Series A funding expires in 3 weeks. You try to launch that empty shell of an app without my servers, Marcus finds out you bought a dud, and your career in venture capital is over before the lawsuit even hits discovery. I could hear him breathing on the other end. I could hear the exact moment the math clicked in his head, the moment he realized he was trapped in a cage he had built himself. 1.5, Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, hateful whisper. And Brandon signs an NDA barring him from ever discussing the internal operations of Apex Capital. I looked at Brandon. He nodded once. Deal, I said. Send the contract to Brandon's email. You have 2 hours. I hung up the phone. The kitchen was totally silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Brandon leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone sitting on the table. He let out a long, shaky exhale. 2 hours ago, I was ready to smash everything I've worked for. Now we're walking away clean. Not completely clean, I said. You still lost your company. I lost a company run by sociopaths, Brandon corrected quietly. I still have the code. I can build something else, something better. He looked up at me, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. You actually wrote it down. Yeah, I said, folding the piece of notebook paper and sliding it back into my pocket. Turns out, it helps. Dad's truck pulled into the driveway a few minutes later. I listened to the heavy thud of his car door closing, the jingle of his keys on the porch. I didn't feel the usual panic, the urge to deflect or charm my way out of the room. I just stood there with my brother, waiting for the door to open, completely prepared for whatever came next.